Good afternoon, South Africa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another episode of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. Well, it's been another active week in South Africa. COVID-19 cases and deaths continues to rise. Gauteng officially has been named as the COVID-19 hotspot in South Africa. And of course, talking about COVID-19, just yesterday, the Department of Health and the Eastern Cape Health Department said that the scooters that were meant to go ahead and take patients from the rural villages to the hospitals was not sufficient or did not meet the criteria. Now, do remember that 10 million rand was spent on these scooters. 10 million rand that could have been used for so many things, but unfortunately, it has gone down the drain. Well, that is a topic for another day. Today we're going to be talking gender-based violence. A few weeks ago, of course, I had a gender-based violence activist and, of course, a victim to discuss about it. We thought maybe it could have stopped after that. But unfortunately, more and more cases of GBV continues to be on the rise. And we need to ask ourselves, when we have a pandemic such as COVID-19 continuing to ravage so many homes in South Africa, so many peoples, can we afford to have another pandemic? Well, at this very moment, it seems it is happening. And that pandemic is none other than gender-based violence. So today, we're going to be discussing the legal ramifications of it. And of course, how do we go ahead and protect the women and children of South Africa? So joining me on the line, I have the director of the Sarki Bartman Center, the chairperson of the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement. I'm speaking to Advocate Bernardine Bacher. Advocate, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. Hi, Advocate, can you hear me? Okay, we're going to try and get the advocate back again. So, yeah, it just seems as if more and more as the days go by, we're getting new reports of gender-based violence that continues to come through here in South Africa. Just the other day, an innocent girl was sent back from her school to go and fetch a mask because she didn't have it when she entered the classroom. What's supposed to be a routine sort of a trip back home ended up having her being raped. And we ask ourselves, how can this happen? How can a girl just be sent back like that to go and get a mask? And this is the difficulty. This is the reality we as South Africans face with right now, that the chances of women and children being raped and murdered and tortured continues to be a daily occurrence. And unfortunately, we have to start putting the question through to our government. You know, what are they doing? What is going on? Just last year, of course, the ministry in the presidency for women and, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa had launched a campaign to go ahead and make sure that they can deal with gender-based violence after the spate of gender-based violence cases that happened in September and October last year. But unfortunately, it seems as if we're having the same tale and the same routine that continues to happen. And that is becoming a big problem here in South Africa, is that this continues to be an ongoing case. And if nothing seems to be working out, then we're always going to be having that problem. So hopefully there can be a way going forward. But as long as COVID-19 continues to ravage homes, the chances of gender-based violence continues to be there also. And I think that is going to be the biggest problem right now. So hopefully there can be a solution to this. And hopefully we as South Africans, and the men in particular, can find a way to make sure that we can play our role in helping our women. So it gives me great pleasure in welcoming Advocate Bernardine Bacher. Advocate, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on Truth to Power.
Good afternoon, Faraz, and thank you for having me.
Now, it's an absolute pleasure. Advocate, of course, I did give a brief introduction to who you are, but since you are on, of course, you are the director of the Sarki Bartman Center and the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement. Let's give an idea to the listeners during, of course, the lockdown period, and especially when the ban on alcohol was lifted. How many cases of women have been coming through to these centers where you are actively involved in?
Faraz, we are seeing an incredible increase in the rates of reports of gender-based violence, specifically since the lift on the sale of alcohol and the ban. And has got to the point where we're actually battling as shelters to actually accommodate all of the women that are seeking our services. So at the beginning of the lockdown period, when we were still in stage 5, we weren't seeing the rates of gender-based violence that we thought we would be seeing, taking into consideration what we were seeing globally. But certainly after the easing of the restrictions and the easing on the ban of the sale of alcohol, we have seen incredible amounts of women coming through and reporting gender-based violence.
Advocate, I just want to touch on, of course, the genesis of the problem, because we keep seeing the stats that, you know, every day, I mean, we've all lost count of the amount of women and children that get raped and murdered. But the genesis of all of this has to start with men, because what sort of men is being bred within the households? Because there is a sense of fear within women, because first, of course, you'll have those stages of denialism. But as men, the role of men right now needs to be questioned. Am I right?
Absolutely. You know, we're always talking about women having to go out and protect themselves and take the necessary precautions. And that is true, because we need to keep ourselves safe. But at the end of the day, the responsibility lies on men. Men are the ones that overwhelmingly are perpetrating violence against women. They're the ones that are actually raping and hurting women. And we need to get to our men in South African society, and especially our boy children, and speak to them about what is gender-based violence and what is healthy conflict resolution mechanisms, because we can't do it as women. It's quite clear that we haven't been able to do it that far. We're always finding women standing up in the protests. We are seeing women are the ones that are talking about gender-based violence across the board. It has only been very recently that we've seen men that are coming into the conversation and to become part of the discourse. And that's what we need to see more of. We need men to become allies with women against gender-based violence.
Advocate, obviously we are going to be touching on the legal ramifications in a bit, but I just want to talk about laying a charge against an abuser in the police station, because what we have seen, and there's been a number of cases where a woman will go to a police station. Number one, either she gets turned away from the officers in charge, or number two, they don't take her serious. How bad are those two problems?
Well, we have historically always experienced challenges with the South African police services and women reporting abuse. It has something that we've always seen. So it is, to this day, it is still a problem. We are finding women that are not being given the level of attention or the charges that they want to lay and demand. We're also finding that women, when they go to report at a police station, not abuse, are not being treated sensitively by the police officials that are actually attending to them. And that's also now engendering secondary traumatization. So we have constantly, as gender activists, said that the police need to be properly trained in order to deal with a GBV survivor, so that she doesn't get re-traumatized when she goes to ask for assistance. And that's something that we really need to be looking at going forward, that there is proper training, that police officers know where their nearest shelters are, that they know what the procedures are, so that women are actually afforded access to justice that our Constitution actually guarantees them.
And you're talking about the Constitution, because the Constitution right now is being trampled upon when it comes to women. And that is the sad fact right now. It's because every time a woman, as I mentioned before, you know, and as you're saying, go to the police station, they've been denied that constitutional right. And we've seen Police Minister Becky Cele continually saying, well, are we going to support women? We're going to support women. It's one thing saying it, but it's another acting on it. And so far, government, in so many ways, haven't acted on it as yet.
That's absolutely true. So what we've seen consistently until approximately November 2018 was government was failing women across the board when it came to gender-based violence. We weren't seeing political will behind trying to get programs and platforms in place that actually would address GBV for survivors. since the presidential summit on GBV and femicide in November 2018, we have seen a slight change. We all know that very recently the National Strategic Plan has gone past Cabinet, has been passed. That's a wonderful framework for an interdepartmental, intersectoral solution to dealing with GBV. And I'm hoping that that doesn't become yet another piece of paper that lies in the desk somewhere, that we actually put that into action, that we actually come up with these programs that would help us across the board, all the way from children that are in school up to police services, to our courts, to our health services as well, all the departments that are failing women as we speak at this moment in time.
Advocate Bernardine, the one question I need to ask is, obviously, we saw last week that, of course, there was a parliamentary sitting with regards to gender-based violence. It was brought by the EFF, of course, and they wanted to take this even further. Of course, you mentioned about a piece of paper that is sitting, right? Mm-hmm. It's nice having the piece of paper. It's nice having everything written down and saying, well, we're going to do this. But do government right now have the resources, number one, and do they have the political will to enforce these reforms to make sure that we do not have another case of gender-based violence or many cases of gender-based violence happening?
I think we are seeing a change in the political will to actually deal with GBV on a concentrated multi-platform level. I think that slowly is changing. The difficulty is resources. Now, KPMG did a research a number of years ago and had a look at how much gender-based violence was actually costing our economy every year. And the answer to that was astounding. It was somewhere between 24 and 48 billion rand every year that government was actually spending on GBV, which ranged from services from the South African Police Service to our courts, to our shelters, and all the way to our health services. So resourcing is going to be a problem, and especially sitting in a economic slump like we are at the moment, it is something that's really concerning to gender activists on the floor.
And of course, now I want to bring the whole resources perspective to it, Advocate, because with our economy contracting, there are obviously going to be cases where a lot of shelters are not going to be receiving the necessary finances to maintain the upkeeping. And as more and more, as you mentioned, as more and more gender-based violence cases occur, the more and more women are going away from abusive homes. They're going to be coming to these shelters. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a center like yourself, how important is it to make sure that financially there's stability that's happening right there? And worst case scenario, if the finances aren't coming, what then for these shelters? Because women need these shelters. This is their only source of, safe haven, as one could say, to make sure that they don't go back to that abusive home and suffer more cases of gender-based violence.
So yes, absolutely. Just to give you an example, so the Saki Barkman Center, which is one of the largest shelters in the country, we are our main sponsor, like most shelters, and with most shelters the same thing is that it's possibly the only secured sponsor is the Department of Social Development. Now at the Saki Barkman Center, we are sponsored to 37% of what we need every year to keep the doors open. What that means in real time pre-COVID was that I needed to find 6 million rand to keep the center running optimally. Pre-COVID, that was an almost impossible task. It is now a Herculean task because we are now sitting with a situation where shelters have increased in expenses like PPE, like health support, like staff transport. We don't have the ability to fundraise that we did previously because most of our fundraising would involve things like golf days and or entertainment events, which are restricted at the moment. So it is getting to the point where shelters, and we're hearing shelters saying, I'm closing my doors in the face. So yes, it is a concern. It's a grave concern for us as the National Shelter Movement, as the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement, is how are we going to be able to keep our doors open with increased expenses, with decreased fundraising, and what are we looking at going forward with an economy that's in a complete slump? So yes, it causes quite some consternation where we're sitting at the moment.
Advocate, Social Development Minister Lindiwe Zulu last week, or I think it was 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned that the department itself wants to get involved with regards to shelters. So has there been any communication with social development from a national level just to assist the homes, but not only, the Sarki Parkman Center, but other homes across the Western Cape, where, of course, I'm sure that you are liaising with to make sure that each and every woman who is being abused has that sort of a safe haven?
We have had some assistance here and there since we've gone into the lockdown with PPE on different levels from the Department of Social Development. That certainly has happened within the Western Cape. We have been calling within the Western Cape for an increase in the sponsorship, in the monetary contribution because of the increased expenses. And there has been some assistance to actually divert some of the funding that we're receiving from some of the programs into things like buying PPE or health support. So there definitely has been that support specifically within the Western Cape. We have a very good relationship in the Western Cape as the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement with our DSD department. But it's not something that is rolled out across the country, and that is a problem. And we are still sitting in a position where we don't have enough funding. So although there has been an effort to assist us, we are not getting the assistance that we actually need to actually alleviate the strain that comes with trying to keep open in times of a pandemic.
Advocate, I want to talk from a psychological perspective before we go to the ad break. Of course, gender-based violence went to probably its worst level ever when, of course, the case of Uyanene, the passing away of Uyanene. Then, of course, last month, Tsegofatso Pule, of course, a pregnant Tsegofatso Pule who was brutally murdered. And, of course, the child was 1 month away from being born. The psychological effect on many girls, especially in the townships, because yes, one could say maybe in the urban areas there could be a sense of protection, that maybe your friends are there, maybe, if you're living in a flat or an apartment, you'll have friends that will be there to just maybe, see that, okay, if you are being abused, let me step in and help. In the townships, of course, it's completely different because it's sometimes isolated incidents. Talk to us about the psychological impact, especially with women from the townships. I know that a lot of them come through to the Sarki Parkman Center for protection. You there, you see it every single day, Advocate. Give us an idea of just how difficult it is for women, especially from the previously disadvantaged era.
So I think I can say with confidence that no woman in South Africa across the board feels safe.
I agree with you, definitely.
It is something that is constantly that you have to be aware of the environment that you're in, and you have to constantly be aware of if you're putting yourself at risk and how you're going to get out of risk. That is just something that as women in South Africa and girls in South Africa, we live with every single day. But certainly within the townships, women are coming out of the townships traumatized because they're not only experiencing episodes of abuse from perpetrators, but there are so many other aspects of ongoing violence from different perpetrators. So the psychological impact of gender-based violence is something that is very difficult to deal with. It's something that is very difficult to heal completely. They always say it's the wound that never really heals, because it has ramifications for every aspect of your life. It has a negative impact on all your relationships going forward, because obviously it impacts on trust. So across the board, women that are coming into the Sarki Parkman Center from the surrounding community, from the townships, are highly traumatized. By the time they've got to that gate, they are so traumatized, and they've got to the point where there's no other option that's open to them. And that's what I always say is when somebody gets to the gate and they want to come into a shelter, they are desperate. But it takes such a huge amount of courage to say, I'm here and this is my last option.
I'm in conversation with the advocate Bernardine Bacher. Of course, she's the director of the Sarki Parkman Center and the chairperson of the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement. After the break, we'll be talking the legal ramifications of gender-based violence. When rape happens, when, of course, there's abuse that is happening, what then for the woman? Legally, what is the rights of the woman going ahead to the courts and laying their charge to make sure that the perpetrator gets the punishment? Stay tuned to Truth to Power. Welcome back to Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. I'm in conversation with Advocate Bernadine Bacher, the director of the Sarki Bartman Center and the chairperson of the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement. Thank you so much for staying on the line with us, Advocate. Now, Advocate, a few weeks ago, I had a similar interview about gender-based violence with a victim. Her name was Cindy Joel. She told me that she chose to basically move on from what had happened to her. So she finds solace in moving on from what had happened. Many women in that regards won't be doing that. They want to make sure that the perpetrator is punished. From a legal perspective, what are the rights of women when going ahead and laying a charge against the person who abuses them?
Okay, so there's two different avenues. One is obviously the laying of a criminal charge at the police station against the perpetrator for either assault or assault GBH or grievous bodily harm or any other similar charge. Then there's obviously the protection that is afforded by the domestic violence court, where you can approach the court, and it's supposed to be a very speedy, it's supposed to be a very easy application to make to get a protection order against the perpetrator.
Now, talking about protection order, because there's so many cases where women want to get the protection order, it doesn't come in time, and the violence continues to happen. So from that perspective, what do the courts need to do to make sure that they speed this up and get that protection order through? Because so many times it's a little too late.
Yes, unfortunately, we all know about the case of Altisha Corky, who went a couple of weeks ago and approached the court for a protection order. She was allegedly turned away with dire consequences, fatal consequences for her and Renisha, her daughter. We are receiving reports across the board from survivors that are saying during the lockdown period they are finding it increasingly difficult to get protection orders, that they are being turned away by court officials. Obviously, this is completely and utterly unacceptable. So we have had in the Western Cape, we recently, a number of organizations like the Kelly Foundation, Heinrich Boll Foundation, Mosaic, and a number of academics got together, and lawyers for human rights. We had a meeting with the Deputy Minister of Justice, and we just said to him, this is the reports that we're getting on the ground, just from the survivors that are coming to us and saying, I was told to come in. I got there. I was told to come back 2 or 3 days later. I was involved in a case a couple of weeks ago. It was a Friday afternoon. Actually, it was early, but it was a morning when I was approached. A woman had gone at 11 o'clock to a Cape Town domestic violence court, had been told to come back on the Monday, which is totally unacceptable. Access to justice has to be prompt within a DV court. Justice delayed is justice denied, and that's never more true than when you're dealing with a woman that has been subjected to gender-based violence. So what we've done is we have formed a loose associations of those organizations, and we're busy with a nationwide survey of challenges that are being experienced by survivors at DV courts. And that what we're going to be doing is taking that information and relaying it back to the Department of Justice, obviously with the idea that the challenges, the gaps, and the problems are actually addressed. We know that the Altisha Corky case has been referred to the public protector, which I'm very encouraged by. But I hope that that investigation is made as wide as possible, that it doesn't just concentrate on a narrow scope, but that the public protector actually investigates how survivors are experiencing domestic violence court across the board and what their challenges are.
Advocate, I just want to read a piece of, obviously, the Constitution of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 32 of 2007. Of course, they say the age of consent in South Africa is 16 years of age. Now, let's just look at it from beyond 16 years of age. When one talks of consent, does it legally need to be a mutual contract? Now, I'm talking about, of course, a man and a woman that are above the age of 16. Does it legally need to be a contract, a written contract, Or could it be something of word of mouth? And of course, in today's day and age, can it be through social media platforms like WhatsApp or even the simple SMS? How does consent between a man and a woman get agreed in today's day and age, especially with a lot of women coming out and saying, we did not give consent to have any sort of sexual activity?
Consent needs to be expressed, and that is something I would say across the board to my children and to any children or women that I encounter. And it not only needs to be expressed consent at the time of entering into any sort of sexual activity, but one has to constantly be tapping in and seeing whether consent is still relevant. So is the woman still at that moment in time consenting? Because if she consented to sexual activity 2 weeks ago, it doesn't mean she's consenting today. So, we need to speak to our sons about consent. Do they understand the true meaning of consent? And that is something that has to expressly be determined, that the woman is actually consenting, but she's also consenting right now.
And I think that's going to be the more difficult perspective, making sure that when is the consent given? Because as you say, consent now doesn't mean consent later on. Advocate, I want to speak about so we saw with the Tsegofatso Pule case, what had happened was, of course, the perpetrator was in court. It's now been delayed because of a whole lot of COVID-19 issues that are happening. Now, everyone's been questioning the justice system. Is there heavy-handedness been handed down on the perpetrators? What needs to change in order to make sure that the heaviest sentence is given to the perpetrators? Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa, during a ANC a virtual press conference along with with the allied unions, said that no bail should be given to those who commit rape or gender-based violence. So how does one balance that? Because constitutionally, and of course legally, someone needs to get, obviously, the opportunity of bail. But if you have cases like this, then surely from a human perspective, someone would say, well, forget bail, because he needs to pay the heavy price.
Yes, the difficulty lies when you have to weigh up each case individually. But I agree with what the president has to say, that the bail conditions on the granting of bail, rather, should only be granted in the most exceptional of circumstances. So one has to make sure that we aren't, and we saw this last year with a number of people, men that were actually let out on bail and then committed further crimes against women, that perpetrators are not gone to bail just as it is, as a matter of course, that there is some investigation into whether that is relevant in the case and is reasonable to actually have him back on the street. So we need to get stricter with our bail applications, stricter with our bail conditions, and we need to be looking at heavier sentencing. We can't have light sentencing in the case of gender-based violence because it doesn't act as a deterrent in those instances, and that's what we should be looking at. We should be getting to the point where before a perpetrator commits a crime or an act of gender-based violence, he thinks, wow, I'm not going to do this because it's going to mean that I'm going to be in jail for a very long time. And we haven't got to that as yet with South African society, that men are thinking before they actually perpetrate these acts that, you know what, this is going to be taken seriously, I shouldn't be doing this.
And I think, Advocate, we don't want to end up in a situation where we're being run by a police state. I know this is a completely different topic altogether, but of course, if we continually see cases like this where bail is being given, even if it's at a low amount, and heavy sentences are not being given, we'll end up being in a police state where we'll have police officers basically in every area. And as you said, gender-based violence is spread all across. It's not, in a certain isolated area. So how does, justice, along with the Constitution, how do we find a balance to make sure that the perpetrators are giving that heavy sentences? Because it just seems as if we're moving away. It's more like a slap on the wrist, and that is an insult to the women of South Africa.
Absolutely, it is an insult, and I think that the President Cyril Ramaphosa has come out and said that we should be looking at our sentencing. We should be looking at our bail applications. And that is something that just will take some time to filter down. The saying that the wheels of justice turn slowly is very apt. So it's going to take time. Of course, we don't have the luxury of time for this change in attitude to actually filter down to every magistrate that's sitting dealing with the matter of GBV or every judge. So more attention should be made to the fact that we should be looking at very harsh sentences for perpetrators, and we should be looking at bail in instances of GBV being the exception rather than the rule. And this is something that we should be dealing with across the board as a campaign by government to ensure that these things are happening.
Advocate, I want to speak about, the Uyanene murder that of course happened. Now, her perpetrator, who was of course working at the post office in Claremont, had a case of rape or gender-based violence to his name, but nobody knew about it. I don't know if the employers knew about it. So how does one go ahead, number one, in making sure that those who have a criminal record, especially a record of rape and any sort of domestic violence or abuse, is never given an opportunity to work again? And number two, how do we protect women from that? Because this was an innocent girl, a student, a bright student who could have contributed to the economy of South Africa in a massive way, who went through to the post office to collect whatever it is that she needed to collect. And unfortunately, she had lost her life. So from somebody who's been in the legal industry for a long time, who understands every single piece of legislature, how does one go ahead and make sure that this does not happen and that perpetrators who have a record don't get themselves involved in the employment of South Africa?
So it's very easy to actually, as an employer, to actually find out whether somebody has a criminal record. It is as easy as actually applying to the police for a police clearance certificate. And I know that there are companies that specialize in doing this for employers. You pay your fee and they go off and they get the requisite information for you. But it's also very important that when employers are actually contracting for positions where children are specifically a part of the area of employment, or women that are vulnerable, that we make sure that our employees are not on the register of sexual offenders. And that likewise is just a matter of making application to the Department of Social Development to find out whether the person that you're about to employ is on that register. So we should be using these mechanisms so that we don't have another place where, like Uyinene, where it should have been picked up right at the beginning when the perpetrator actually applied for employment, that actually he wasn't eligible for employment in that position, in a position of trust, because he had a record against him.
Advocate, we have to speak about another issue which of course leads to rape and so many aspects of sexual violence, and that is of course pornography. Now, of course, during the parliamentary sitting, there were a number of political parties who were saying, all right, let's get rid of pornography in South Africa. Let's ban websites or any sort of application that leads to pornography. But remember, there's a money aspect to it. Whoever's, of course, dealing with this sort of content make money out of it. So how does one go ahead and say, right, let's erase pornography just like that to make sure that it does not have some sort of contributing factor to any sort of sexual violence?
In South Africa, we have a huge problem with women that are trafficked, specifically trafficked into these positions. So, and this is a problem that is actually increasing all the time. It is happening. It's happening in our neighborhoods. We're just not aware of it. So the objectification of women and that comes from pornography is something we certainly should be dealing with, and we should be dealing with it at the highest level. We should be saying that this is actually not acceptable. That's another aspect that we haven't really given much attention to up until now, and it's certainly something we should be looking at going forward.
Advocate, fake information, false news, false accusations, this is something that obviously since September, since the murder of Uyanene, has been coming up. Now, a lot of celebrities, of course, have been accused of either rape or some sort of abuse. Now, on face value, and this is something that I generally go ahead and practice, and a lot of people would say, well, Faraz, you can't be doing these things because you don't know the full aspect of it. When a woman does report that she's been abused, in many occasions, she's not lying about it. And there's been so many cases where it has turned out to be true. But there have been occasions where there have been false accusations that have been labeled. And this has, of course, damaged the reputation of that certain person. So from a legal perspective, advocate, how does one balance truth with fake news?
It is a balancing act. So obviously everybody is innocent until proven guilty in court of law. And I always say that when it comes to accusations of gender-based violence, specifically in a society like South Africa, specifically when you look at the amount of times that women have failed to come forward to actually report abuse because they're not believed, because their reports of abuse are not given the serious considerations that they have. So women are not feeling confident enough to come forward and say, I'm actually being abused, can you assist me? So I always say, in the instance when a woman comes to you and says to you, I'm being abused, believe her, because it's unlikely that she's actually making it up. It's much more likely that it's happening until such time as you know otherwise, because the chances of her then not getting the help that she needs or going back to the abuser because she's not taken seriously and suffering further harm is a chance we can't afford to take.
But advocate, what happens if, and I completely agree with you that 99.9% of the time, that if a woman is complaining about abuse, she's always correct. I think both you and I can agree on that. But what happens if there is a case that she's doing it either for fame, and unfortunately this is a case, and we hope that this does not happen again, but there are cases of it. What happens if she's doing this for attention, for fame, and to damage the reputation of a person? Because I was once told a story about a boy who decided, well, let's just play a joke where he says, the lion is eating my sheep. Nobody believed him. He kept on saying, the lion is eating my sheep. No one has believed him. And on the third time, when he said it, the lion actually ate the sheep. And nobody believed him. And they went there and they saw, well, the lion ate the sheep. So how does one get that balancing act correct to make sure that women should not be doing this, especially during a time where gender-based violence is so high?
Yes. Yes, it is a problem because you just get one case where it's publicized that a woman lays false charges, and that has serious and detrimental effect to every other woman that wants to come forward and say, I'm being abused. So it's absolutely essential that we make sure that doesn't happen as far as possible. So what that boils down to is our police services. Are they doing the investigation to the extent that they should be doing the investigation? So it's the strength of the police investigation as well as our justice system. And if both of those arms of government are working as they should, if the police investigation is actually investigating properly, the police should pick it up almost immediately that actually this is a false charge. Likewise, even if it gets all the way to the court should be dealing with it right then and there and being able to determine whether the accusation is false. But it is the basic tenets of law, and we mustn't lose sight of the fact that one is innocent until proven guilty.
Advocate, we are going to be wrapping our conversation with just a few more questions. Last year, government, along with the minister in the presidency for women, launched a campaign where they said, all right, so we're going to be having some sort of a war room to combat gender-based violence. You did say that strides were being made, but there's still so much to go, especially during the lockdown, especially with the lifting on the ban of alcohol. So going forward, the future, what more does government need to do to make sure that these daily cases of gender-based violence are limited? We may not eliminate it once and for all, but if there can be a halving of it, that would be great, isn't it?
Absolutely. So, What we need to do going forward is to make sure that we're looking at gender-based violence not only when there's a spike in GBV rates in South Africa, not only when it comes to 16 days of activism, not only when it is Women's Day. This should be something that we should be looking at as a government, as South African citizens, and it's a responsibility that all of us have across the board. 365 days a year. We should be giving attention to this all the time. What has happened so far is we have a very good framework to deal with gender-based violence. Our National Strategic Plan is a very good piece of paper. That just needs now to be put into play. We need to get all of the aspects that the National Strategic Plan speaks to. We need to get those implemented, and we need to have it up and running. Once that happens, and there's political actually pushing that, and if the framework is actually resourced, which is so important, it's no use having this wonderful piece of legislation that we actually can't resource. So the resources need to be ring-fenced for the National Strategic Plan. Once that's put into place, I'm hoping that we'll be seeing a decrease in the rates of gender-based violence.
An advocate with regards to women's shelters, I mean, in our eyes, you're already a superwoman for the work that you are doing right now in making sure that you are caring for those who are coming from abusive homes. But what is the future for women's shelters if, the lockdown does continue, and especially with cases continuing to rise with regards to COVID-19, the ban of alcohol, the lifting of the ban of alcohol still being there? So the role of women's shelters in South Africa, how important is it going to be going into the future as long as gender-based violence cases are still on the rise?
So the Commission for Gender Equality last year came out with a report that was called the Investigative Report into the State of Shelters in South Africa. And basically that report said that shelters played a critical role in dealing with issues of gender-based violence in South Africa, and shelters were under-resourced, underfunded by the government, but they also weren't funded uniformly. So you sit with situations where in one province, shelters would get an allocation of 40% of what their expenses are, and in other provinces it would be either more or much less. So there's no uniform funding, there's no uniform funding of capacitation of shelters. In some provinces, the managers would be funded by the Department of Social Development, whereas in others, that wouldn't be happening. So what we need to do is, in order for shelters to actually get through this lockdown period and actually manage to keep their doors open, we need to be increasing funding across the board for all shelters and making sure that we all uniformly are funded. Because if that doesn't happen, our worst apprehension is going to happen, and that is that shelters are going to slowly start to close doors. At this moment in time, in the Western Cape, we are juggling all the time to make sure that every woman that comes to us actually gets into a shelter. It takes an enormous amount of effort because of the huge demand for services of shelters during the lockdown since the lifting on the ban of the sale of alcohol. So in order that we don't actually get to a point where we are actually having to close our doors, government's going to have to come up and resource us better and say, listen, I understand that you have more expenses. I understand that you're unable to fundraise as you ordinarily would. We need to help you with that. So here's hoping that actually does happen. Otherwise, it's going to have dire consequences for shelters in South Africa.
Advocate Bernardine Bacher, we thank you so much for making the time for us. Continue to do the good work. And of course, the work that the advocate is doing in helping so many abused women and children in the Sarki Apartment Center. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for giving me the platform.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Well, there we go. Advocate Bernardine Bacher, the director of the Sarki Apartment Center and the chairperson of the Western Cape Women's Shelter Movement. Well, that's all we have for you here on Truth to Power. Do join me again next week, same time, same place, right here on ITV Networks. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.